my good friend. So, Mr. Backlash, who do you think I am? You raise my taxes and freeze my wages, send my son to Vietnam. You give me second-class houses, second-class schools. Do you think that all colored people are just second-class fools? Mr. Backlash, I'm gonna leave you with the blues, yes I am. When I try to find a job to earn a little cash, all you got to offer is your mean old white backlash. But the world is big, big and bright and round, and it's full of other folks like me who are black, yellow, beige, and brown. Mr. Backlash, I'm gonna leave you with the blues, yes I am.
And that was the great and always apropos Nina Simone with Backlash Blues. Welcome to LFM, a weekly progressive intersectional queer show by and for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, two-spirit, non-binary, gender non-conforming, intersex, queer, and questioning communities. Our program originates from listener-sponsored non-commercial WBAI Pacifica Radio in New York, 99.5 FM, and streaming on WBAI.org. Our programs are archived at outfm.org, where you can also sign up for our e-newsletter with program announcements. And you can follow us on Facebook, X, and Instagram. I'm Bob Lederer, joined by my co-host, Pauline Park. Good evening, Pauline.
Good evening, Bob. On this show, we'll be speaking with Matthew Lyons, a longtime researcher of the far right and racist organizations, about the aftermath of the assassination of Christian nationalist Charlie Kirk and the Trump administration's use of it as a pretext to pursue suppression of freedom of speech, retaliation against liberal and left communities, and escalated attacks on the trans community. We'll briefly touch on the Federal Communications Commission's explicit effort to force ABC to remove Jimmy Kimmel. Although for now his national show has been reinstated, it is still subject to the whims of the right-wing networks of affiliate stations that first removed him. We'll start with a simple step that very few media outlets have taken, which is to read and play a tiny sample of Kirk's own bigoted words directed against Black people, lesbians and gay men, trans folks, and others he viciously maligned for years. Together, these quotes paint a very different picture than the widely acclaimed practitioner of spirited discourse.
We will also play a recent interview later in the program by our radio colleague Janine Jackson, program director at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, or FAIR, about the administration's attempts to control, censor, and manipulate the mainstream corporate media. She spoke with Tim Carr of the advocacy group Free Press, which seeks to democratize the media and opposes censorship. And incidentally, that's totally separate from and opposed to the similarly named right-wing pro-Zionist website called Free Press, that's headed by Barry Weiss, reportedly soon to become head of CBS News. So let's plunge in. Pauline?
Ta-Nehisi Coates, acclaimed author of the article The Case for Reparations and the book Between the World and Me, among other works, recently compiled some revealing quotes from Charlie Kirk for an article he wrote for Vanity Fair, writing, and I quote, "Before he was killed last week, Charlie Kirk left a helpful compendium of words, ones that would greatly aid those who sought to understand his legacy and import. It is somewhat difficult to match these words with the manner in which Kirk is presently being memorialized in mainstream discourse. For example, New York Times columnist Ezra Klein dubbed Kirk one of the era's most effective practitioners of persuasion, and a man who was practicing politics in exactly the right way. In fact, Kirk reveled in open bigotry. Indeed, claims of Kirk's civility are tough to square with his penchant for demeaning members of the LGBTQ plus community as freaks and referring to trans people with the slur tranny. Faced with the prospect of a Kamala Harris presidency, Kirk told his audience that the threat had to be averted because Harris wanted to kidnap your child via the trans agenda. Garden variety transphobia is sadly unremarkable. But Kirk was a master of folding seemingly discordant bigotries into each other, as when he defined the American way of life as marriage, home ownership, and child rearing free of, quote, the lesbian, gay, transgender garbage in their school, end of quote, adding that he did not want kids to, quote, have to hear the Muslim call to prayer 5 times a day, end of quote. New York mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani was a Mohammedan, with Kirk supposing that anyone trying to see Mohammedism take over the West would love to have New York a prior Anglo center, as Kirk called it, under Mohammedan rule. Kirk habitually railed against Black crime, claiming that, quote, prowling Blacks go around for fun to go target white people, end of quote. He repeated the rape accusations against Yusuf Salam, a member of the exonerated Central Park Five, who is now a New York City Council member, calling him a disgusting pig who had gotten away with gang rape. Haiti was, by Kirk's lights, a country, quote, infested with demonic voodoo, whose migrants were raping your women and hunting you down at night, end of quote. These Haitians, as well as undocumented immigrants from other countries, were having a field day, per Kirk, and coming for your daughter next. The only hope was Donald Trump, who had to prevail lest Haitians become your masters. Jewish donors, Kirk claimed, were, quote, the number one funding mechanism of radical open border, neoliberal, quasi-Marxist policies, cultural institutions, and nonprofits, end of quote. Indeed, quote, the philosophical foundations of anti-whiteness has been largely financed by Jewish donors in the country, end of quote. Words are not violence, nor are they powerless. Bearing the truth of the Confederacy, rewriting its aims and ideas, and ignoring its animating words allowed for the terrorization of the Black population, the imposition of apartheid, and the destruction of democracy. The rewriting and ignoring were done not just by Confederates, but also by putative allies for whom the reduction of Black people to serfdom was the unfortunate price of white unity. The import of this history has never been clearer than in this moment, when the hard question must be asked. If you would look away from the words of Charlie Kirk, from what else would you look away? Those are the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Thank you, Pauline. And now we want to play a few short clips in Charlie Kirk's own voice, preceded by or followed by the people whose words he has distorted and attacked. First is from the children's educational TV program of Ms. Rachel, or Rachel Accurso, followed by Kirk's attack on her.
Happy Pride to all of our wonderful families and friends. This month and every month I celebrate you. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're exactly who you are. To those who are going to comment they can't watch the show anymore because of the support, no worries and much love your way. God bless. I am not chasing fame or views. I'm standing strong in love. I've shared prayers on here before and said God bless, and that's because my faith is really important to me. And it's also one reason why I love every neighbor. In Matthew 22, a religious teacher asked Jesus, what's the most important commandment? And Jesus says to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. There's no greater commandments than these. I believe it's mentioned 8 times, love your neighbor. So yes, everyone belongs, everyone's welcome, everyone is treated with empathy and respect. It doesn't say love every neighbor except. There are so many reasons I stand strong in love. I stand with everyone. That's who I am. And the love back and the God bless if you disagree is genuine.
Charlie Kirk
is in Leviticus 18, is that thou shalt lay with another man shall be stoned to death. Just saying. So, Miss Rachel, you quote Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. The chapter before affirms God's perfect law when it comes to sexual matter.
Charlie Kirk.
Joy Reid and Michelle Obama and Sheila Jackson Lee and Ketanji Brown Jackson were affirmative action picks, we would have been called the racist. But now they're coming out and they're saying it for us. They're coming out and they're saying, I'm only here because of affirmative action. Yeah, we know. You do not have the brain processing power to otherwise be taken really seriously. You had to go steal a white person's slot to go be taken somewhat seriously. Play cut 52.
But I rise today as a clear recipient of affirmative action, particularly in higher education. I may have been admitted on affirmative action, both in terms of being a woman and a woman of color. But I can declare that I did not graduate on affirmative action. This is my personal story.
I hear because of action affirmative. She can't even say that. We know. It's very obvious to us that you were not smart enough to be able to get in on your own. I couldn't make it on my own, so I needed to take opportunities from someone more deserving. This is how arrogant Joy Reid and Ketanji Brown Jackson and Michelle Obama and Sheila Jackson Lee are. They're so narcissistic, they think this is persuasive. They think we're like, of course. That's why we need affirmative action. Because you have impressed us with your brilliance. Of course. Oh no! Imagine the world without Joy Reid. Imagine the world without Sheila Jackson Lee or Michelle Obama or Ketanji Brown Jackson. They think this is persuasive. They think as they kind of now reveal that I'm only here because of anti-white, anti-Asian, forced discrimination policies. That turned me into a bitter, resentful activist.
And finally, the voice of J.D. Vance.
The writer accuses Charlie of saying, and I quote, "Black women do not have brain processing power to be taken seriously." But if you go and watch the clip, the very clip she links to, you realize he never said anything like that. He never uttered those words.
And there you have J.D. Vance flatly denying the words that we all just heard about Black women lacking the brain processing power, quote unquote, to qualify for school or jobs. So that's where things are at in this country today. And earlier, you heard the voice of course, Charlie Kirk, but also then the late Congress member Sheila Jackson Lee, who he was ridiculing, and then Kirk again, followed by J.D. Vance.
Yes, let's now turn to our guest. Let's turn to our guest, Matthew N. Lyons, who's a regular contributor to the radical anti-fascist website Three-Way Fight, as well as co-editor of the book Three-Way Fight, Revolutionary Politics and Anti-Fascism, and author of Insurgent Supremacists, the U.S. Far Right's Challenge to State and Empire. He lives in Philadelphia. Thanks for joining us on Out of Fam, Matthew.
Thanks, Pauline. I'm glad to be with you.
Thanks for being with us. Can you just start with some key facts about Charlie Kirk's life that have generally been ignored or misreported by the mainstream corporate media? And in particular, talk about the billionaire forces that are behind him, that funded and trained him to become the powerhouse of far-right youth organizing that he did become. And also, where did he fit into the ever-expanding right-wing ecosystem, and in particular, into Christian nationalism?
Sure, and let me start by saying that it was very helpful to hear the excerpts that Pauline read and also the clips of Kirk's own voice, which I think do a good job of highlighting the bigotry that was, very integral to his political ideology and his message, and is a big part of what has been glossed over in many accounts of him, the sort of efforts to kind of sanitize his memory. In terms of the other things you asked about, let me take that in two parts. So you asked about the billionaire forces that helped to bankroll and aid him in his organizing efforts. And I think this is certainly a key issue. And I noticed actually that Forbes magazine, which is not exactly a leftist magazine, had a very informative article about this yesterday, which details the hundreds of millions of dollars that Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA were able to raise over the period from when TPUSA was founded in 2012. The bulk of this money came from right-wing billionaires, starting with a guy named Foster Friess, who Kirk was able to connect with relatively early on in his political career. But then a number of other wealthy and powerful men who were, in many cases, active in supporting a number of right-wing causes. And I think this is, it's characteristic of the way that a lot of right-wing politics has developed in the US over the last half century or so, in that, first of all, a lot of this money came from individuals who represented businesses concentrated in the Sun Belt, although not exclusively. That's been characteristic of a lot of the kind of right-wing funding that we've seen. But more broadly, I think it's the combination of capitalist support and grassroots organizing that has really been critical to the way that the MAGA movement developed and so many other right-wing forces since the Reagan era and on. It's not simply that these forces are creations of right-wing capitalists. There is some genuine popular support behind figures like Charlie Kirk, but the capitalist support, both in terms of money and also contacts and networking and other kinds of intangibles, have also played an important role in bolstering and helping to channel and direct at least a large part of that kind of organizing work.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Pauline?
That was extremely informative, Matthew. I have a question. The prosecutor's charging document states that the partner of the alleged assassin, Tyler Robinson, is trans and is collaborating with the investigation. How is this issue being used to further demonize the trans community? And what's your assessment of the threats to the trans community from the Trump administration and the MAGA movement, both before and especially in response to the Kirk assassination?
Well, the demonization of trans people is something that the Trump administration has been engaged in from the very beginning. Some of Trump's very first executive orders from the very day that he set foot in the White House earlier this year were directed against trans people. So there's been a whole series of steps that have been involved. So we're not seeing any kind of, change of direction. It's more a matter of acceleration. In terms of the Kirk assassination specifically, even before they had the police had identified the current suspect, there was a lot of speculation about the motives behind the shooting that centered on the bullet casings that had been found, which were left at the scene and which had inscriptions written on them. And there's been a lot of discussion. I'm not going to go into details. Long story short, these were basically reflections of a lot of memes and phrases borrowed from video game and social media subcultures. But people read a lot of political messages into them. And early on, there was a claim that these were a reflection of quote unquote transgender ideology, whatever that is. And that was quickly dropped. But then when there was the reporting about the suspect's romantic partner being trans, that was something that was picked up and has certainly been played up by a lot of right-wing media. I mean, for example, the New York Post had a headline 10 days ago, Charlie Kirk assassination, latest shooting committed by trans people and advocates, implying or, really stating that this was the latest in a whole series of mass killings and other acts of violence perpetrated by trans people, which is, a type of falsification and propaganda that the MAGA movement has been engaged in for some time. To bring it back to the Trump administration, I think one of the latest steps has been the talk about the FBI apparently is considering designating trans people as a group as practitioners of so-called nihilist violent extremism, which is one of the categories that the FBI has created to categorize domestic terrorism. And just the idea that you could categorize an entire group of people as a particular kind of terrorist, I think is just, it's really, it speaks to the level of demonization and political vilification that we're facing at this time.
Indeed. I have a question about related to motive and particularly the alleged assassin's mother. The prosecutor's charging document claims that Tyler Robinson's mother said, quote, over the last year or so, Robinson has become more political and had started to lean more to the left, becoming more pro-gay and trans rights oriented. That was reported by CNN. The prosecutor also said Robinson's mother told police that her son claimed that Kirk, quote, spreads too much hate, end of quote. End of quote. Is there anything yet known independent of this prosecution claim about Tyler Robinson's politics and potential motive for killing Charlie Kirk?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I think it's important to point out that those statements which are attributed to Robinson's mother appear to be paraphrases. I mean, it's not clear that those are actual quotations of her own words. I mean, it's possible that they are, but it's really not clear. And if they're coming from, the prosecution or from the FBI, then I think we need to look at that with a very strong degree of skepticism. Secondly, in terms of whether there are other sort of independent sources that we have, I mean, it's certainly pretty limited. But one thing I would point to is a recent article by the investigative reporter Ken Klippenstein, who has a Substack that's been covering a lot of the issues related to the Kirk shooting. And Klippenstein, in this article, quotes from an interview that he did with a personal friend of Tyler Robinson, and also includes excerpts from some Discord chats, which Robinson and his friends were part of, in which there's discussion of the Kirk shooting and other issues. And these paint a picture that's very different than what, is described by the prosecutors. They paint a picture of Robinson as somebody who was not really political, or certainly not political in a way that you could easily categorize as left wing or right wing, but, was really, concerned about things like video games and camping and, just a lot of sort of recreational stuff. And the friend who Klippenstein interviewed calls into the question the extent to which Robinson's own family was familiar with his politics, and suggests that they may not have actually been aware of or in the best position to assess his political leanings. Now, I don't want to say that this is the correct version. I don't know, but I think there's definitely reason to be skeptical about the prosecution's claims.
And we're speaking with Matthew Lyons, who's a contributor to the radical anti-fascist website Three-Way Fight, as well as a published author on several topics related to the far right. And we're going to come back to part 2 of this interview after this musical break.
So we'll be playing a song by the great rocker Neil Young, who retooled his big hit, Big Crime in DC, which he introduced a few days ago at a Farm Aid conference. So let's listen to Big Crime in DC. And that was Big Crime in DC at the White House by the famed rocker Neil Young.
Many people, and this is Bob Lederer with Pauline Park, many people believe that the Trump and MAGA forces are using the assassination as a pretext to undermine the First Amendment, both freedom of speech and freedom of the press. For more on this, we're now going to play part of a recent interview done on WBAI's Counterspin program by our radio colleague Janine Jackson, Program Director of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, or FAIR, about the administration's attempts to control, censor, and manipulate the mainstream corporate media. She spoke with Tim Carr of the advocacy group Free Press, which works to democratize the media and oppose censorship, and which is incidentally separate from and opposed to the similarly named right-wing pro-Zionist website called Free Press, headed by Barry Weiss, who's reportedly soon to become the head of CBS News. So let's hear that. And before we play that recording, we just want to remind you you're listening to WBAI 99.5 FM in New York, streaming at WBAI.org, part of the Pacifica Network. And I'm Bob Lederer with Pauline Park. Okay, let's hear that report. And I'm just reminding everyone we're a listener-sponsored station. We rely entirely on your support, and we ask those of you who have not yet become a member or a supporter to do so now by going to buddy.wbai.org and make whatever donation you can afford. You can either do a one-time donation or become what we call a buddy, which is a monthly sustainer at any amount you choose from $10 on up. So we hope folks will do that and perhaps designate as your favorite show Out FM. So can we hear that recording now? All right. Well, while we're waiting for the engineer to connect that, let me go on to an issue that's...
I have it.
Okay.
Even listeners who don't track the business part of the media business will know that Disney's ABC has suspended, in their language, indefinitely, the night talk show hosted by Jimmy Kimmel, declaring the comedian's comments about MAGA responses to the killing of right-wing activist Charlie Kirk so unacceptable as to warrant silencing. A search for the reasons a journalistic outlet would make such a decision could start with the response to it. Donald Trump said, quote, "Congratulations to ABC for finally having the courage to do what had to be done," close quote. And new FCC Chair Brendan Carr thanked Nexstar Media Group, which owns and operates many ABC stations, and had promised to preempt Kimmel for, quote, "doing the right thing." So Trump and the head of a media conglomerate and the head of the federal agency charged with advancing the public interest in media just happen to share a very specific understanding of what the right thing is when it comes to censoring political views. But that's not quite the whole story. Joining us now to talk about what is neither starting nor ending with Jimmy Kimmel is Tim Carr, Senior Director of Strategy and Communications at the group Free Press. Welcome back to Counterspin, Tim Carr.
Hi, Janine. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, Jimmy Kimmel talked about right-wingers trying to, quote, "characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points from it," close quote. FCC Chair Brendan Carr called that the sickest conduct possible. So right there, we can just sit with that for a second. A Fox host called for unhoused people to be given lethal injections. Just kill them, Brian Kilmeade said. But that didn't amount to actionably sick conduct. So what does is failing to praise a person who said, well, actually, you're not supposed to say what Charlie Kirk actually said, because that in itself is somehow unfair to his legacy and, in fact, will put a target on you. We're obviously in the topsy-turvy here, rhetorically, where recounting someone's hateful speech is hateful speech, because when he said it, it was God's merciful love or a, hyper-intelligent debating technique or whatever it is they come up with tomorrow. But it's all the more reason to keep our own heads on straight and to address what's happening, which clearly this is just one piece of. So what concretely has happened here? How should we understand it?
Well, I mean, all of the headlines of the past week have dealt with the death of Charlie Kirk, and at least for the part of the story that you and I are particularly interested in the media's response to that. And there has been a concerted effort across mainstream media outlets to kind of canonize, to literally whitewash Charlie Kirk's history, so that some of the horrible things that he's said, and he has said many horrible things, are no longer referenced. And obviously, so, we have this incident, we have this response, we have now the story of ABC deciding to let Jimmy Kimmel go, or at least to suspend his programming. And what it is part of a larger pattern. What we've been doing at Free Press through the Media Capitulation Index is looking at the largest media companies, 35 large media companies, and measuring the degree to which they have capitulated to President Trump. And this is all part of a project by the Trump administration to basically control the message, to control the media. And they have been more effective in this administration than he was in his first administration of figuring out where those pressure points are. And those pressure points are often with massive media corporations that have business before government. They're seeking approval of a merger, as is the case with Nexstar and Tegna, as was the case for Paramount. And in order to get onto the government's good side, they have to capitulate. They have to do whatever the chairman of the FCC, Brendan Carr, tells them to do and whatever the White House tells them to do. So while, what we're seeing is one outrageous incident, I think people need to understand it's part of a pattern, an extortionate pattern, where the government, where the White House is shaking down media owners in order to get them to follow the Trump agenda.
Well, some folks might think extortion is a heavy word, but FCC Chair Carr said, quote, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." These companies can find ways to change conduct and take actions on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead, close quote. This is not several steps away from extortion. You are looking for a merger. You're looking for beneficial federal policy. And we as a federal agency want you to change your tune. So, what's going to happen? That's not how policy and lawmaking is meant to work.
Well, no, Carr's language feels like it comes straight out of The Godfather, right? It's like, you can work with us or you can work against us, right? And while he has been taking a victory lap, this is Chairman Carr at the FCC, every time one of these companies capitulates, there are bigger questions about whether the FCC should be in the business of doing this. Obviously, there are First Amendment restrictions against government interference in editorial content. The problem is that the media who is supposed to be reporting on these outrages is largely intimidated by this administration. So too often they soft pedal these stories of extortion, of seeking bribes from media companies, of forcing media companies to fire talent, to block editorials, to block presidential endorsements. It's a First Amendment story. And unfortunately, the companies that have the freedom to report on it aren't willing to take up their constitutional right and speak truth to power. In this case, speak out against this extortion that's happening at the hands of Brendan Carr and the Trump White House.
It's so dispiriting and, not to stay at the level of language, but the twisting of language and elite media's resistance to untwisting it, rather than just saying, well, some say others differ, is just galling. Carr said, we at the FCC are going to enforce the public interest obligation. If there's broadcasters out there that don't like it, they can turn their license into the FCC. It's a very, you could say creative, you could say weaponized use of the term public interest, isn't it?
Yes. The public interest, as far as the Federal Communications Commission is concerned, it's largely that the agency, when it's doling out broadcast license, we all own access to the public, or we all own the public airwaves, and the agency hands out licenses is to promote, this is one of the founding principles of the FCC, is to promote diversity. That's become a loaded term.
Right.
Localism and competition. And what they've done, claiming it to be in the public interest, is they've rooted out diversity within these companies, and already media companies are largely owned by wealthy white male individuals. But they've also, through the approval of mergers, they've gotten rid of competition, and they turned their back on localism. As you merge local news companies, local television stations, local radio stations, you get these economies of scale where they use syndicated content rather than local reporting to cover the news program for these many stations that they now own.
So it's important to understand how structure affects content. Sometimes when we talk about ownership, it's abstract because people are thinking about what they saw on the television last night, but this is where these things connect. And this is why an understanding of media concentration, media consolidation, this is where it meets the idea of, if you don't want to see folks fired for not being appropriately eulogizing Charlie Kirk, this is why you need to understand who owns your local station.
Yes, and the problem is that many of these owners are billionaires who have massive corporate empires. You look at the owner of the Washington Post, for example, Jeff Bezos also has a company called Blue Origin, which is in space exploration, and they have bid in for billions of dollars worth of government contracts from NASA, essentially to help put U.S. spaceships into orbit. So when you have these massive corporations, you also have massive conflicts of interest. And someone like Jeff Bezos has clearly demonstrated he's more interested in the bottom line, in his profits, than he is in the principles behind the First Amendment. So he has manipulated the Washington Post in ways that allow him to wrest editorial control from a lot of the journalists who work there.
Well, it matters, again, very much how the news media that we still rely on cast this fight that we're in and cast this, situation that we're in. And we don't really see an independent press fighting valiantly against moneyed interests and state power. And if we don't cast the fight in the way that the fight really is, then people get confused about what's happening and what meaningful intervention might look like. So I just want to ask you, what would good journalism, and I know it's out there, I know it's happening, what does it include? What does it exclude, that we need?
So we, as I mentioned earlier, when we did the media capitulation index at Free Press, we looked at the 35 largest media companies and judged their level of independence versus compliance, and in the worst case, acting as pure propagandists. But what we found is that size does matter, but in the wrong ways. These companies are too big not to fail. That is, when you get to a certain size, a media company like Paramount or Disney becomes so entangled with government because they have so many competing interests,
right,
that they fail in their mission to act as the fourth estate, as a check against the powerful and speaking truth to abuses by politicians and billionaires and others. But as you get smaller, you're finding more and more local, independent, many times non-commercial outlets that are doing good journalism because they don't have these corporate overlords who are making decisions based on their bank accounts.
Right. And folks should look out for those and find ways to contribute at that level. Also, I know that Free Press is saying, call your ABC affiliate about, if we come back to the Kimmel firing. And I understand that people might think that that's not so meaningful, but, talking back to big media is still a muscle that we need to exercise to get it strong. I'm Janine Jackson. Thanks for listening to Counterspin.
And we want to thank Pauline Jackson, Program Director of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, who was interviewing Tim Carr of Free Press on our own Counterspin program, which airs Fridays from 6 to 6:30 p.m. And to put these issues into fuller context, I want to read an excerpt from a cogent essay written recently by another WBAI colleague, attorney Mimi Rosenberg, producer of Building Bridges and Equal Rights and Justice, and also a member of the Ida B. Wells Media Defense Network, which I'm also part of. And Mimi wrote as follows: "The First Amendment is often treated as a sacred text of American democracy, guaranteeing the right to free speech and free press. Yet, in practice, it is neither absolute nor universal. It has never offered carte blanche protection to political dissenters. Mahmoud Khalil and other immigrant journalists have faced surveillance and imprisonment. The First Amendment does not and never has guaranteed unfettered freedom of expression. It is at best a transactional doctrine, one circumscribed by law, politics, and power. It's in this light that we must confront the fraud of figures like Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA. Liberal society often insists that even the most venomous rhetoric must be defended under free speech grounds, but this position is profoundly mistaken. Kirk's rhetoric is not simply opinion, it's a political weapon designed to entrench white supremacy, degrade marginalized voices, and normalize authoritarian. His speeches and campaigns do not seek democratic debate, but aim to silence opposition, mobilize hate, and enact policies that strip away fundamental human rights. To defend Kirk's speech as an expression of democratic freedom is to collapse the distinction between dissent and domination. Speech that seeks to annihilate others' voices and lives cannot be dignified as part of democracy. It is the antithesis of democracy. Kirk and Turning Point must not be lionized as martyrs of cancel culture, so-called, or free expression. They must be recognized as active agents of a project to extinguish freedom itself. That's why we insist that press freedom cannot rest on the hollow invocation of the First Amendment alone. The amendment, as history shows, has failed time and again to shield dissenters from the wrath of empire, capital, and reactionary courts. Real press freedom must be defended through a panoply of political strategies, legal defenses, and grassroots organizing that fight against censorship, repression, and the weaponization of speech as a tool of hate. And again, those were the words of our WBAI colleague, Mimi Rosenberg, member of the Ida B. Wells Media Defense Network. So now finally, turning back to our guest, Matthew Lyons, researcher on the far right. In the few minutes we have remaining, can you talk about the administration's actions since the assassination to try to crack down on dissent, and even more in a more draconian way than they already have in their first 8 months. And so where are we at with democratic freedoms such as they are in with the Trump administration?
Well, I think that the Trump administration has used Charlie Kirk's killing as an opportunity to accelerate and intensify the authoritarian power drive that was already underway, that's really been underway since even before Trump came back into the White House. And the crackdown on the media, the kind of intimidation that we just heard detailed, and extortion, that's one piece of that. And there are many other pieces. The ICE raids, of mass kidnappings of undocumented immigrants and others, the just extensive ignoring of separation of powers and legal limits on presidential authority in all kinds of spheres. All of these are pieces of it. And I think one of the things that's been striking since Kirk's assassination has been the intensification of vilification, not only of trans people, but also of leftists and anyone who is seen as political dissenter. And even though there's no credible evidence linking Kirk's shooting to the left or Antifa or one of these kinds of forces, these are the folks who the Trump administration and its supporters are blaming over and over again and calling for a systematic crackdown and suppression of the left. And this is very dangerous. I mean, this is something that we need to resist. We need to find ways to, put ourselves in the way of the machine of repression, and also to counter the climate of fear and the climate of intimidation that's been going on, and that they're trying to intensify.
Indeed. And Pauline, do you have a final question?
Well, I don't know if we have time for it, but if we do have half a minute, do you, Matthew, have any particular advice for listeners, what they can do in response to the Trump administration's assault on democratic freedoms, and any websites or media outlets that you'd recommend that people monitor to follow ongoing developments?
Well, I think this is a time when we need to, employ a lot of different tactics, and people, there are some people who are going to feel moved to confront ICE agents in the streets. There are other people who are going to support legal challenges. There are going to be people who want to do banner drops. There are going to be people who are going to want to write letters. And it's important that we think about ways to see these different efforts as complementary rather than in conflict or in competition with each other. And I think this is also a time when it's important for people to think about security. Not paranoia, not start accusing people without evidence, but be mindful that repression is growing and surveillance is growing. As far as websites and media outlets, there's a lot out there. I would point in terms of trans issues specifically. I mean, I think Aaron in the Morning by the writer and activist Aaron Reed is a really helpful source. I found Ken Klippenstein's Substack to be very helpful with regard to the Charlie Kirk materials. Kelly Hayes' newsletter, Organizing My Thoughts. And then there's a lot of established left media that certainly includes this radio station. So there's good voices out there.
Indeed, there are many, and folks need to be attentive. So I want to draw people's attention to our program's website, outfm.org, where we've posted several resources where you can get more information on the topics discussed in tonight's show, including that new Ida B. Wells network for defending press freedom. And I really want to thank our guest, Matthew Lyons, who's an anti-fascist researcher and writer, as well as co-host Pauline Park and Counterspin producer Janine Jackson and her guest Tim Carr. And also thanks to our intern, R.T. Maharaj, for her great help with sound clips. And also thanks to co-producer John Riley for invaluable technical and production assistance. And then finally to our studio engineer, Max Schmid. Thank you very much. I'm Bob Lederer, and until next Tuesday at 8, stay strong and keep fighting for justice. Now stay tuned for Cat Radio Cafe as we go out.
Paseo y Franco.